Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. The webinar which we're going to be speaking about today are science-based targets and what do they mean for businesses. So today we are joined by Sam Hadfield from SustainIt, and we're also delighted to be joined by David Wynn from Greenstone. So today's agenda, we're going to be speaking about why are science-based targets needed, what are they, and how are they set, and of course, what are the benefits. David then will be jumping in and speaking about how companies can track their progress against science-based targets, followed by some case studies and practical steps as well. At the end of the webinar, if we've got time, we will have some questions. So during the course of the webinar, you should be able to see this kind of dialog box with your GoToWebinar. Please ask any questions. We'll kind of moderate them as we go and ask them at the end if we've got any time. So without further ado, Sam, I will make you presenter, and over to you.
Thanks, Callum. So let's start off with why are science-based targets needed? So many businesses already have targets to reduce emissions and are measuring and disclosing these as part of their sustainability strategy. So what has driven this change to a science-based approach? Now, over the last 2 centuries, greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise, as you can see on this graph, due to an increase in industrial processes and fossil fuel combustion. And as emissions rise, so does our global average temperature. At the current rate, it is expected that the average temperature will rise by 4 to 6 degrees at the end of this century. Now, already we are seeing an increase in extreme weather conditions linked to climate change. As temperatures continue to increase, our way of life will be challenged. We'll see more droughts and heat waves, sea levels will rise, and food and fresh water availability will be affected, just to name a few. It's clear from this that there needs to be a greater strategic effort to reduce emissions globally to avoid these consequences of climate change. As you all know, the United Nations have recognized this threat and in the Paris Agreement have set out to hold the increase in global average temperature to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial level and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5. Now, what this means is that compared to 2010, we need to reduce emissions by 49 to 72% globally by 2050 to reach the 2 degree target at minimum. So what are science-based targets? Now, the Paris Agreement has set out a very ambitious aim, and there's a lot of work to do. However, even with the world's governments committing to reduction in greenhouse gases, there will still be a gap to achieve this 2 degree target. And businesses have a key role to play in closing this gap. 100 companies are said to be the source of over 70% of global greenhouse gases. So the Paris Agreement has provided a framework for setting targets based on the latest climate science, and also to set targets that have a long-term perspective looking further than just 2020. So how exactly do we define a science-based target? Well, in line with the Paris Agreement, emissions targets are said to be science-based if they meet the level of decarbonization needed to keep the global average temperature increase below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. At this point, you're probably thinking, but how do we calculate that? What percentage does my business need to work toward to meet this target? So how do you set a science-based target? Well, there are many approaches and methods out there to derive a target. Let's have a look at some of them. So there are 3 main approaches. Sector and absolute-based targets approaches use the carbon budget calculated by the IPCC. Now, this budget outlines the remaining amount of carbon that can be emitted to reach that 2 degree target by the end of the century. So this can be absolute. So, for example, all companies can cut their emissions by 50% by 2050 to keep within the budget. Or the budget can be allocated to different sectors, as in the sectoral decarbonisation approach. So the carbon budget is divvied into sections, and then the sector budget is divided further to individual businesses based on a variety of factors, such as their contribution to that particular sector and expected trends in the market. Other businesses may take an economic approach, focusing on a business's contribution to global GDP. Now, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and choosing your method will depend on your business, but there are plenty of resources available through the Science Based Targets Initiative's website to help you set your goals. So what are the benefits of setting a science-based target? Well, aside from protecting the planet for future generations, there are many business benefits to setting a target. First of all, it drives innovation. So by setting this ambitious aim, you're creating what Kellogg's described as a startup mentality. Employees in these businesses will be engaged and encouraged to think out of the box, to resolve problems, and to develop new low-carbon ideas. It will save you money. Now, whilst there can be an initial cost in implementing some low-carbon technologies, the long-term savings greatly outweigh this, especially as these technologies become more widely available and cheaper as innovation drives this area of development. So, for example, consumer goods company P&G reported a $500 million site saving over 4 years through energy efficiency programs alone. So it can really make a difference. It'll improve your reputation. More and more groups of individuals are basing their decisions on the environment. Employees want to work for businesses that share their values, and consumers increasingly want to know where their products came from and what they are made of. Investors are aware of the risks and opportunities as well of climate change and are looking for a business that can align their strategy to the Paris Agreement. By announcing a science-based target, you're making a very open commitment to environmental responsibility, and one that is credible and has been externally verified. Finally, you're ready for changes in public policy. Not only will you comply with current regulations, but you'll be one step ahead of the game when more demanding ones come into place. As industry leaders, you'll be able to set an example to peers and work with governments and policymakers to help shape new legislation. I'm going to hand over to David at Greenstone, who's going to talk a little bit about how to track your progress against these targets.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam, for the introduction. So I'm David Wynn, I'm the Head of Client Services at Greenstone. And we're going to go through some case studies and some examples of how companies have been setting science-based targets. So firstly, we'll have a look at how businesses can track progress once they've set a target. And then we'll go through a few case studies of companies that have done that with some themes related to how they're setting those targets. We'll then have a look at some practical steps for how you can then start to build those targets into your strategy and look at actually reporting on them. And I'll then pass back and we'll have a few questions at the end where we have time. So just for a bit of background, Greenstone, we work with organizations to enable data that talks to you. We do that through software and services across non-financial reporting. So we work with organizations globally to help them manage that data and to get robust data for reporting. And through that, we work with organizations and have seen companies that have grappled with how they can actually sort of set science-based targets. And I think there's three key themes or areas in which science-based targets are difficult and challenging and that present something new for companies that traditional target setting may not necessarily have set before. So these are firstly around scope, so looking at the scope of these targets and how they're different from traditional target setting. Secondly, the length, and that's a key challenge in terms of looking at long stretching targets. And for a lot of organizations, this isn't necessarily something that they've looked at before in terms of setting such a long-term target. So we'll have a think about some of the challenges associated with that. And thirdly, they can be different because of the type and the type of targets that they're getting organizations to set. So firstly, if we look at scope, with science-based targets, to set a science-based target, you should include Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Now, under the best practice and under guidance associated with setting the target, it's encouraged that Scope 3 is included within that science-based target setting, where it's a significant contributor. So, for a lot of organizations, Scope 3 emissions can be a significant part of their overall footprint, both in terms of internally looking at things like water, waste, and travel, but also in the supply chain as well. So if you look at organizations like Puma, for example, that have looked at years ago at their environmental P&L, they're very focused on Scope 1 and 2. They've just recently relaunched that, looking more holistically at Scope 3 and much further down their supply chain. And it's important that significant parts of your overall impact can be within that Scope 3, and therefore setting a science-based target without them for certain organizations would be falling short of the mark. So in terms of some tips around tracking progress, it's important firstly to ensure that you have a robust and granular baseline data set to be able to set these targets. With any target setting, that's an important aspect and thing to have in place. But particularly with science-based targets, when you're setting and committing publicly to such long-term targets, it's important that you have good foundations within the data, both in terms of its robustness, but also a good granular set of data so that you can see how things will change. It's also worthwhile thinking about scope-specific targets as well. So even though as a whole, as an organization, science-based targets are generally across multiple scopes, and there'll be one sort of headline level commitment to carbon reductions. It's worth having a look at how scope-specific targets might enable you to, again, provide a bit more granular context to the activities and focus that you're going to be putting in place. And tying into that, it's useful to think about initiatives, and within each of these scopes, what initiatives would fall within those, sort of from the outset of that target setting process. The second key aspect of science-based targets that are sort of different and that can pose an opportunity and a challenge are the length of them. So a science-based target must span at least 5 years, and mid and long-term targets are encouraged to 2030 and 2050. So as I say, for a lot of companies, this will be something that's new, and often organizations will look up to, say, 5 years in target setting. So looking out to 2030, 2050 can bring something new to the table. So a few tips around this aspect. Firstly, think about tracking in-year progress as well. So of course, there's this commitment to a science-based approach, which makes sense. But think about how you're going to track those in-year progress targets as well internally, and what information and data you would need to be able to do that. Alongside that, it's helpful to think about monitoring parallel distributed targets according to relevant normalization metrics. So when we have a look at the type, we'll see that you're encouraged to set absolute and normalized targets. So the absolute is helpful in terms of that global picture of global carbon reduction, but actually in a business context, normalized targets offer a much more realistic look about how your impact is evolving with the scale and scope of your business changes. So those normalized targets are extremely helpful, and distributing those across your organization to get more granular targets from the outset will really help to facilitate a more sort of interesting message about where your biggest impacts have been. And finally, just on the length, think about reviewing targets annually and recognizing where restatements need to be made. There's often restatements can be an opportunity because you say, well, actually, emission factors may have changed, and therefore it's relevant for us to restate, or it could be scope changes within there. So even though you are committing to this long-term target, still recognize that there will be points where reviewing the targets throughout the process will still be in place. And thirdly, just thinking about type. So with science-based targets, you'd be encouraged to set an absolute target, but also to look at intensity targets as well. We would always try and encourage organizations to not forget about consumption targets. So carbon is extremely useful. I mean, obviously not useful in the atmosphere, and we're trying to get rid of it, but it's useful in terms of it provides a common language for environmental impacts, so you can aggregate your impact as an organization into a single unit. But consumption targets are often much more relatable for people. People understand a kilowatt hour, people understand a litre, and so they can be extremely important and useful to set alongside carbon targets, particularly as companies are reducing the carbon mix within organizations such as the grid anyway. So in terms of some tips, set both absolute and intensity, recognize that science defines the minimum requirement. So for a lot of organizations, I appreciate that setting a science-based target and picking a methodology will define a target that maybe seems a stretch, but actually the science should be the minimum as well. So do keep in mind where there are opportunities to stretch beyond that. And then finally about consumption targets and how they'll add value, particularly for certain stakeholders. So those are some of the areas in which science-based targets are different, and they can be presenting those to different groups. We'll have a look at a couple of case studies now, just in terms of some different types of organizations and how they've engaged with science-based targets. It's just worth pointing out that if you have a look on the Science-Based Targets website, there are a number of case studies on there about how companies have set targets, but there's also a list of companies taking action as well. So through that, you can search through and have a look at companies, competitors, peers that are similar to your organization, and you can search by country, region, sector to be able to see other companies that have set targets, which can be a useful way to look at the landscape within your individual sectors. So I just pulled out 4 case studies and thinking about different themes and how companies have used these within these different areas. So looking at how science-based targets have leveraged leadership, looking at framework linkages within science-based targets, looking how partnerships can be leveraged to set them, but also to deliver on them. And then lastly, looking at a business as usual in terms of companies that are carrying on, and science-based targets have been something that have been done retrospectively. So firstly, in terms of leadership, if we have a look at Sopra Steria as an organization, so Greenstone, we work with Sopra Steria. They are a French headquartered organization that provide transformation services to organizations. They were one of the first companies to set a science-based target, and it's really been a key driver for the organization in terms of defining what information will be collected. And so for a lot of those early companies that were setting science-based targets, one of those key drivers was leadership and being at the forefront of that. There's now over 300 companies that have committed to setting them, and so the mood has shifted slightly, and so now we see that companies are looking to say, well, actually, our peers are all setting it, so we need to be keeping up with them. Another example just to pull out is Target, and what they've done is linked in their science-based target with other frameworks. The Climate Group, as I'm sure many of you know, run a lot of great global programs, which are, again, similar commitments for organizations. One of those is RE100, and Target have committed to RE100 and really sort of tied that in with their science-based target as one of the key ways in which they're going to commit. So often within the sustainability space, there can often be a sort of reporting fatigue with lots of different types of reporting, different frameworks, different requirements to disclose information, and science-based targets can be, seen as something else within that. So what it's important to do is see where there's opportunities for linkages with other frameworks that you might already be reporting to, or other ones that are out there, and drawing the synergy between them to be able to deliver on the targets. Another one which Sam mentioned earlier is around P&G. They're interesting just to pull out. There's a full case study of how they've actually set their target and the methodology they've specifically used on the Science-Based Target website, which I've just summarized here, so I won't go into too much detail. But I think the way that they're interesting is the way that they've leveraged partnership. So they've partnered closely with WWF in terms of setting their target and also looking at opportunities for delivering on that target. And again, they're a good example on Scope 3, where Scope 3 is obviously a significant part of their products and their supply chain. So without including Scope 3 in their science-based targets, it wouldn't be as strong or relevant. And finally, I just thought I'd throw Dell into the mix here. It's worth having a look at Dell and how they've set science-based targets, because their approach has almost been slightly backwards in the other way around, in the sense that they went through an exercise sort of as business as usual of consolidating goals and targets, looking at different timeframes and frameworks, and have set a legacy of good plan in place and set all of that up. And once that was then set and in place, they then approached the Science-Based Targets Initiative to see whether their targets were science-based, which they were. So they're now part of that. So it's just worth pointing out that, you know, for some organisations this will form part of, they will already be putting goals and strategies in place, and that assessment may come as a sort of further down the line. So there's a few examples there of companies, just I'm trying to pull out some of the sort of themes and the ways that they've used science-based targets. What we'll close on now is just a few areas thinking about how you can embed science-based targets within a strategy, and then at the end, just a few sort of takeaways on some practical tips. So I thought it was worth pulling out some things from CDP. Obviously, a lot of organizations will have reported to CDP and will have got results or will be waiting for supply chain results. And if we have a look at CDP from 2008, so company target setting is motivated by market forces, not scientific requirements. And 84% of organizations in CDP in 2008 had a target deadline of 2012 or before. So very short terms in terms of looking at the target setting. If we contrast that to this year, we see a complete shift where we've got organizations that are being much more future-driven in terms of looking at setting science-based targets. We've got 14% of the overall setting them in line with CO2 decarbonisation requirements. There's another 30% as well that are aiming to set a science-based target within 2 years. And from last year, that's over 60% increase. So we're seeing a real uptake. And it's important to sort of have a look at that, because as it has built that momentum at that speed, it does mean that, you know, engagement with them becomes much more of looking at your peers and being part of it, and actually moving towards a context where setting a target that isn't science-based would be questioning whether it's relevant. So in terms of incorporating those into your strategy, this is just a sort of very simplified version of a traditional target setting process where you have a baseline year in your information. Typically, organizations would go through stakeholder engagement on what's achievable, what can we do, what's the stretch target, and they would then set a target. Often organizations find science-based targets can be slightly challenging because they disrupt that traditional model slightly, whereby you can take all of that baseline information, you can plug it into one of the models, and you then get a target. So the question really becomes about where you engage stakeholders on what's achievable and what's the stretch target within that. And something that a lot will do is calculate it, and then that stakeholder engagement piece will be afterwards on, okay, how can we achieve that? And for a lot of people, that can be the daunting piece. So we would always try and encourage people to involve stakeholder engagement on what's achievable and targets, still as part of the whole process, to make sure that actually, once you have those targets defined, you've already started to engage your stakeholders, and you've got the foundations for a plan of action to be able to deliver on those targets. So finally, I just wanted to leave you with a few key engagement tools and ideas to sort of take away. So firstly, have a look at peers and competitors. It's always helpful to see what they're doing. It's also a good driver for internal dialogue with senior stakeholders about why you should be setting those types of targets. Look at partnerships and collaborations with people that can help you in terms of setting them, defining them, but also as well other organizations that will be able to facilitate and help. Tailor the business case for your organization's values and purpose. So the models and the way that you set science-based targets, there's lots of methods of doing that. But actually, you know your business better than anybody and what will resonate with people internally, but also other stakeholder groups as well, like clients and investors. That links on to the next point, which is know your audience and align messaging with benefits that will resonate with people. In terms of engaging senior level influencers, think about who will influence senior level staff. So is it investors? Is it employees? Is it material clients within that? Is it CDP scores? Recognize the opportunity for supply chain engagement that science-based targets can offer. So, we think about science-based targets in a similar way to the Sustainable Development Goals. They're much more systemic, they're outward-looking. That's what we need, and actually that's an opportunity for supply chain engagement more than ever. And finally, linking target to other programs and benefits, so EU directives and other frameworks as well. So I will now pass back to Callum for questions, and we can take things from there.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thank you very much, Sam, as well. We did have some really good participation during the webinar, so thank you for everyone for getting involved. I'll just fire a couple of questions at you guys before we conclude. The first one, I think, will be for you, David. We had a few people ask about Scope 3 and how it might relate to science-based targets. So we've got one question here. It's kind of two questions. So should I include Scope 3 emissions in a science-based target? And on top of that, what defines a significant contributor, a Scope 3 significant contributor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. It's sort of difficult to respond directly to the company without knowing who it is, but I can follow up afterwards. So you should include Scope 1 and 2 when setting a science-based target, and Scope 3, as they say, should be included if it's a significant contributor to your organizational footprint. So within that, it will depend on what type of company and organization you are within there. It's a little bit like with mandatory carbon reporting, say, in the UK, where Scope 1 and 2 emissions are mandatory to be included, and Scope 3 was encouraged, whereby you could exclude Scope 3, but actually to have a relevant target for organizations, really it would be best practice and to include that within that. Yeah, so I'm happy to follow up directly on specific organizations and have a look at it. There's not a sort of clear cut, oh, it should be this much of your overall footprint, really. And it will also depend on the model that you use as well. So there's not a one size fits all in terms of the calculations for setting a science-based target. So it'll depend primarily on those two parameters, the organization type and the model that's used.
Thank you very much. And just to point out that we do have a lot of questions that have been asked. We will be in touch with everyone privately after the webinar's concluded. I do have a very quick one for you, Sam, I think, and that is how many companies are taking actions towards science-based targets at the moment?
Sure. So I think David actually included sort of an overall figure at the moment. So as it stands at the moment on the Science Based Targets website, there are 317 companies that are committed. Now, what that means is that they have submitted the commitment letter to Science Based Targets Initiative that they want to, work to set these targets. Then once they've been through the process of developing their targets and submitting them for review, what we now actually have is a total of 76 companies that have their targets set and have been publicly announced. I think this is one of the questions that have been asked, the difference between committed and target set. That's it. It's getting on board with the process and actually having gotten to the end of the process.
Brilliant. As you can see, we've got some contact details up on the screen for you. So if you'd like to contact either Sam or David directly, then please go ahead. Otherwise, we will try over the next few days to contact anyone who asked any questions. Other than that, I will be uploading this webinar to our YouTube channel, and all kind of peripheral details relating to this webinar will be sent as a kind of mass email to everyone. So thank you very much for attending this afternoon. I hope you found it informative. And yeah, have a great afternoon, evening, or morning, depending on where you all are. Thank you very much.